What if the most horrifying crime scene in American history wasn't hidden underground, but sat quietly inside an ordinary apartment building? What if the real terror wasn't just what Jeffrey Dahmer did, but how long it went unnoticed? Because behind one locked door in Milwaukee, a nightmare existed. And for years, no one truly looked inside. At first glance, apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street looked like any other unit in a working-class building. Beige walls, cheap furniture, nothing remarkable. But the smell was impossible to ignore. Neighbors complained constantly about a rotting, chemical stench that leaked into the hallways. Dahmer blamed spoiled meat. Sometimes he blamed a broken freezer. Other times he laughed it off. And police accepted those explanations. That was the first failure. Inside the apartment, Jeffrey Dahmer lived a life of routine. He worked at a chocolate factory, he paid rent, he spoke softly, he rarely caused trouble. And yet, within those walls, the darkest private crimes in modern American history were unfolding. What investigators would later discover inside that apartment would shock even seasoned homicide detectives. But here's the twist most people don't realize. The apartment didn't reveal its secrets all at once. The truth emerged slowly, room by room, each discovery worse than the last. When police finally entered Dahmer's apartment on July 22, 1991, they were not expecting what they found. The arrest itself happened elsewhere, after a victim escaped and led officers back to Dahmer. At first, it seemed like another misunderstanding, until an officer opened the refrigerator. Inside were human remains, preserved and stored. That moment changed everything. The apartment was immediately sealed. Detectives, forensic teams, and crime scene analysts moved in. What they found inside wasn't just evidence. It was a catalog of methodical horror. The living room was deceptively normal. A couch, a TV, nothing out of place. But the bedroom told a different story. There were photographs, Polaroids, documenting victims in various stages. Not souvenirs for display, but records. Dahmer didn't keep them for memory. He kept them for control. This wasn't chaos. This was planning. And that's what made it so terrifying. Behind the door sat a 55-gallon drum filled with chemicals, used to dissolve human remains. The tub itself had been altered. Pipes were corroded. The air burned the throat. Detectives later admitted this was one of the few times they had to step outside. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of what had been happening there. But here's the part that still haunts investigators. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't improvised. It meant Dahmer expected to keep killing. Drawers contained tools. Cabinets held substances not meant for cooking. Every object had a purpose, and none of it was accidental. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was what wasn't hidden. Dahmer didn't bury evidence. He didn't transport it far away. He kept it where he lived. Why? Because he believed he wouldn't be stopped. And for years, he was right. As the investigation continued, police realized something chilling. This apartment had been visited before. So officers had been there years earlier, after a young victim escaped and was returned to Dahmer, despite witnesses begging them not to. The door had been opened, the air smelled wrong, but no search was conducted. That moment, years before the arrests, became one of the most painful revelations in the case. Not just because of what was missed, but because of what it meant. The truth wasn't hidden, it was ignored. Forensic teams spent days inside the apartment. Every inch was photographed, every surface tested. The deeper they looked, the more they understood Dahmer's mindset. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a controlled environment, a space designed for isolation, secrecy, and domination. One investigator later said, "It felt less like an apartment and more like a laboratory of obsession." And yet, outside those walls, where neighbors continued living their lives, never knowing just how close they were to something unimaginable. But here's the detail rarely mentioned in documentaries. The apartment itself was destroyed shortly after the investigation. Authorities believed it could never be occupied again. The memory was too heavy, the space too tainted. They erased the structure. But erasing the building didn't erase the questions, because even after everything discovered inside, many believe the apartment still hasn't told its full story. There were inconsistencies, missing evidence, Unanswered timelines. Some investigators believe not all victims were identified. Others suspect Dahmer didn't keep everything in that apartment, and one theory suggests something even darker. That apartment 213 wasn't the beginning. It was the end of something much larger. The apartment was gone, bulldozed, erased from the street, but the questions it left behind refused to disappear. Because once investigators stepped back and reviewed what they'd found inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, a disturbing realization emerged. Something didn't add up. In the weeks following the search, forensic reports began circulating quietly among investigators. Evidence logs were reviewed. Photographs were examined again. Timelines were reconstructed. And that's when doubts started to form. Some detectives noticed gaps, not just in Dahmer's confessions, but in the physical evidence itself. Items expected to be present were missing. Certain chemicals were unaccounted for. Some remains didn't match known victims. It raised a terrifying possibility. What if the apartment had already been partially cleaned before police arrived? Neighbors began coming forward with details that hadn't made headlines. Late-night noises, heavy footsteps at odd hours, sounds of dragging. One neighbor recalled hearing power tools long past midnight. Another remembered seeing Dahmer carry large containers out of the building, but never questioned it. Why would they? He didn't look dangerous. That was his camouflage. Then there were the photographs. Police recovered dozens of Polaroids documenting victims, but investigators later admitted something unsettling. The number of photographs didn't match the number of victims Dahmer confessed to. Some images showed individuals never identified. Others showed stages of crimes that didn't align with his timeline. Dahmer claimed he documented everything. But what if he didn't? What if some images and some evidence were removed before July 22nd, 1991? Here's where the story gets darker. In the days before his arrest, Dahmer had visitors, not friends, not family, strangers. Some witnesses later said people came and went from the apartment unusually often during that final week. Yet police never fully investigated who those visitors were or what they may have taken with them. Officially, there was no evidence of accomplices. Unofficially, some detectives weren't so sure. Then came the medical examiner's report. Among the remains recovered, several could not be conclusively dated. Chemical damage made timelines uncertain. Some bones showed signs of treatment inconsistent with Dahmer's stated methods. Which led to a chilling question. Was Dahmer experimenting longer and more extensively than he admitted? And if so, where were the missing pieces? One investigator later revealed something rarely discussed publicly. During the search, certain containers appeared recently cleaned. Not dusty, not neglected, recently handled. That detail never made it into early reports. Why? Because it suggested intent. It suggested Dahmer knew the end was coming and tried to control what would be found. But perhaps the most haunting revelation came from the building itself. Before it was destroyed, engineers and crime scene analysts examined the structure, pipes, drains, walls. They found traces that indicated activity beyond the apartment unit itself. Some evidence suggested disposal methods that didn't rely solely on the apartment's bathroom, which opened another door. What if apartment 213 wasn't the only crime scene? What if it was simply the place where Dahmer felt safest? Former neighbors later recalled something chilling. Dahmer spent long periods away from the apartment, sometimes overnight, sometimes longer. When he returned, he was calm, focused, no visible panic, almost relieved. Where had he been? And what had he done elsewhere? As investigators pressed Dahmer during interrogations, his behavior shifted. At times, he was cooperative. At others, evasive. He corrected officers when they misunderstood details, but stayed vague when pressed about numbers, locations, or timelines. Psychologists later believed this wasn't confusion, it was control. Norma Dahmer wanted to decide what the world would know. And then there was the freezer. Official reports state it contained remains, but internal memos hinted at something else. Items removed before forensic cataloging. What items? By whom? Those questions remain unanswered. Years later, journalists requested access to sealed evidence records. Many were denied. Some files were missing, others were heavily redacted. Why seal documents if everything was already known? Unless it wasn't. Here's the truth investigators rarely say out loud. Jeffrey Dahmer may not have told the full story, not about the apartment, not about the victims, and not about how long it had been happening. And the apartment may have been only the final chapter, because there's one detail that still disturbs those closest to the case. In his final interviews, Dahmer hinted briefly at locations outside the apartment, places he never fully described. He stopped himself, changed the subject, smiled, and moved on. That hesitation wasn't fear, it was calculation, and it suggests something far worse than anyone wanted to confront. The truth didn't end at apartment 213. In many ways, that apartment was only the surface, because when investigators finally stepped back and examined Jeffrey Dahmer's life as a whole, not just the crime scene, they realized something deeply unsettling. The apartment was where the story was discovered, not where it began. In his final interrogations, Dahmer became quieter, less detailed. When questioned about specific locations, his answers slowed. He corrected small details but avoided larger ones. He spoke openly about what police already knew, but hesitated when conversations drifted beyond the apartment. Psychologists noticed it immediately. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't shame. It was containment. Dahmer was choosing the boundaries of the narrative. Investigators later confirmed something that still troubles them. Several locations Dahmer mentioned casually were never fully searched, not because they were overlooked, but because resources were limited, and the apartment alone was already overwhelming. Warehouses, remote properties, dump sites referenced vaguely, then dismissed. The official focus remained on the apartment. But privately, some detectives believed they were only seeing what Dahmer allowed them to see. One retired investigator later said, he controlled the story. Even after arrest, he was still directing attention. That statement changes everything, because it suggests the most horrifying possibility of all. Jeffrey Dahmer may have been curating his own legacy. As time passed, sealed documents began surfacing through journalists and researchers. Not enough to rewrite the case, but enough to raise doubts. There were discrepancies in timelines. Victims who didn't match known records, confessions that conflicted with physical evidence. Dahmer's own words didn't always align with forensic reality, and when confronted with those contradictions, he deflected, smiled, changed the subject. But the most haunting evidence wasn't physical, it was psychological. Experts studying Dahmer after his conviction concluded that control, not violence, was his primary drive. Control over victims, control over environments, winning control over how he would be remembered. Which brings us back to the apartment. Apartment 213 wasn't just a crime scene, it was a stage, a place where Dahmer felt safe enough to act, and confident enough to believe he wouldn't be stopped. That confidence didn't come from luck, it came from experience. Neighbors later revealed something chilling. Dahmer didn't panic when police came. He didn't rush to hide evidence. He didn't flee, because in the past, police had already been there, and nothing had happened. That moment, years earlier, taught him a lesson. He could get away with it, and so he continued. When the apartment was demolished, officials claimed it was to protect the community, but some believe it served another purpose: to close the chapter, to prevent further questions, how to ensure no one would ever walk those rooms again and ask, what else was here? Even today, investigators admit something quietly. The true number of Dahmer's victims may never be known, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because some of it may never be found, and some truths may have died with him. Jeffrey Dahmer was murdered in prison in 1994. No final confession, no last revelations, no answers to the questions he avoided. Just silence, and that silence is what lingers. Because the most chilling truth about Jeffrey Dahmer isn't only what he did, it's how many times he was given the opportunity to stop and wasn't stopped by systems, by authority, by people who assumed monsters look like monsters. He lived quietly, worked normally, smiled politely, and behind one apartment door, Well, not a reality existed that no one wanted to see, until it was too late. If this story proves anything, it's this. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for permission. And as you sit with this story, remember the victims, not as statistics, not as headlines, but as lives that mattered, lives that deserved protection. If this documentary moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, like the video to help keep these stories told. Comment your thoughts. Your voice matters. Subscribe to Echoes of Crime for deep, respectful true crime documentaries that uncover what history tries to forget, because some truths only survive when we're willing to listen, and some echoes should never fade.